All right, good afternoon. Welcome back to part two of our afternoon, but also part two of our fisheries briefing. We've heard from the charter industry a little while back, and now we have Secretary Kurtz. And Mr. Secretary, I don't know if you're on your own, if you have anybody with you, but thanks for being here, and we will turn it over to you. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee for having us today to talk about fisheries. I will be joined by my colleagues after I go through the presentation to help me with questions, but our Assistant Secretary for Aquatics, Kate Charbonneau, our Director of Fishing and Boating Services, Lynn Fagley, will join me. So today I want to do a couple things. One, kind of give you the basis for how we make fisheries management decisions and why, and then walk through what our the status of some of our key fisheries are, both in the tidal and non-tidal space. So first, when we look at how we design studies and surveys for our fisheries management, a lot of it can be traced back to the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery in 1992. And what we saw during that fishery collapse was really an over-reliance on harvest data and not enough of a reliance on science-based surveying. And so what we were seeing was our watermen, and the watermen then, very good at their jobs, very good at finding fish and catching fish. And so what happened with the cod fishery was, instead of having these surveys where you're looking across the landscape of where the fish may be and their suitable habitat, you were following them to where they were. And that over-reliance on that type of science really created a scenario where it appeared that there were twice as many fish in the water as there were. And that led directly to the collapse of the fishery. This was catastrophic economically and ecologically. 19,000 people lost their jobs when the moratorium was imposed. And it really, I think, opened up fisheries managers' eyes to the importance of survey and science-based research and methodology. And it also really highlighted the importance of working together to ensure that we're managing our species, our migratory species, up and down the Atlantic. So I think that's important to remember, because that really changed the way that we in Maryland and many other states think about fisheries and setting up that research design. At the department, we have our fishing and boating services, and really the big focus of this team is to understand the fisheries and the issues related to those fisheries. We do 33 surveys across the entire state. Our staff are on the water 12 months a year, ensuring that they're up to date on what is going on. We're working with our watermen to make sure that we have an ample understanding to the best of our ability of all of the species that we are concerned about. This ranges all the way up to the Susquehanna Flats, to Tangier Sound, and then out into the Atlantic, and then up into the Potomac as well. We have a lot of partners. That's the only way to do this work. We're working with migratory species. So we have the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Council. We have the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We work with academic partners in all of those states, other state agencies similar to the Department of Natural Resources, the commercial waterman industry, charter boat captains, and that industry, as well as the recreational angler. So and the conservation community. So there's a lot of interest in this. And the way that we do this primarily is through our advisory committees to ensure that we're getting the proper amount of work and partnership with those folks. And as you can see, a picture here of one of those meetings. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I think this has been, something that has been in the news and talked about regularly. And this goes back to 1942. It was ratified and approved by Congress. This is an interstate commerce pact. And what we do here is all of the states work together to guide the decision-making and then the planning, and then it is then passed down to the states to implement. And I think one thing that's really important to note, and we saw this experience recently with the charter boat fishermen, is that when these decisions are made, it's a democracy, right? So each one of those states is looking at the system that they have for themselves and are trying to ensure that any of our management decisions aligns most effectively to the way that their industries are laid out, and those industries being recreational and commercial. And so what we saw here in Maryland recently, and was, I think, discussed in the previous briefing, was our charter boat captains had the opportunity to bring home 2 fish. We were the only state that was able to provide that opportunity to our charter boat captains. So when it came to a vote, when we were seeing this decline in the species up and down the coast, we lost that ability. While the department made that motion, it's very hard to sustain that when you're kind of the one state that has that opportunity, but others do not. And so we recently had another meeting. We made a motion to do what's called sector separation, basically splitting out the recreational from the charter boat. Unfortunately, that did not pass as well, but that would have given us another opportunity to support our charter boat captain fleet in a way that we're currently not able to. And I think what's very important here, all these pictures you see are of species that migrate up and down the east coast of the United States. So I want to talk about striped bass, an incredibly important species commercially and culturally and recreationally. And I think what you see in this picture is a very positive outlook. We see high biomass for our adult spawners. Fishing mortality is below the threshold. You know, if I showed you this slide without the next slide, we'd all go, yes, this is great. Striped bass are in a good spot. But the issue is we are not seeing that sustained in the juvenile populations. And so what we see in this graph is our juvenile age index. And what I also wanted to highlight here is this is not the only way that we are validating the health of the species. There are multiple surveys done on striped bass throughout the year that are focused on different age classes. And we do that to ensure that we don't miss anything. So one year, let's say 2020, we saw a really down year on the juvenile age index. 2021, the same thing. But then in 2022, in one of our gillnet surveys, we see a bunch of 3-year-old fish. We're going to know we missed something in the JI. And so what we have not seen is that associated increase in those smaller fish in those different age classes. What we are seeing is a very robust population of very large trophy-sized striped bass. I don't know if anybody remembers this from last year, but Torrey Smith, holding like a 52-inch, I think, striped bass that he caught in the middle of the bay. You know, that is from an age class where you see one of these very high bars on the bar chart, still really holding up that population. And so we've heard a lot of stakeholder concerns, and we're really following this because future management actions are going to be discussed next year. And so what are we doing at the department and the state of Maryland to ensure that we're providing a robust population, but also supporting all of the users of this group? We've created and convened a joint committee on striped bass management. What we're trying to do is align each one of our user groups' interests so we can put together, I think, more novel and new techniques across the East Coast for managing the species. We hosted a science workshop, a stack workshop in partnership with UMCs and many of our partners in February. And that, again, is evaluating the way that we do science. Things are changing rapidly in the bay, and that is impacting our striped bass population. And we need to make sure that we are tracking those things, whether it be food availability for the young, impacts of predatory species like blue catfish. We recognize that we need to put more tools in the science toolbox and tools that, frankly, we can use at ASMFC. And that's really important. At ASMFC, the science we do has to be peer reviewed. It has to meet a rigorous set of criteria. So we need to ensure that whatever new tools we put in can be validated and used by ASMFC for their decision making. So next I'll turn to another equally iconic and delicious species, and that is the oyster. What we see in the bay right now for oysters for the past several years has been a really consistent population, one that is reflected in our commercial harvest, and it's also reflected in the health of our Big Five sanctuaries. We have our ongoing stock assessment, so this will set some new benchmarks that's going on. It'll be discussed by the Oyster Advisory Commission in May, and we'll use that information to set our target levels for this coming year. But I wanted to give you an update on what the fall survey showed, some really good news. Our disease is low, is lower than we expected. That's a very good thing. As we saw in previous years, disease can really rip through and have a very negative impact on the species. The biomass was higher than the long-term average for the 7th straight year in a row. So again, that's showing us continued increase in oyster abundance. And the SPAT index. Last year we had a SPAT index that someone described as biblical. I think that is incredibly accurate. We've never seen anything like that. It is not as great as that, but it is still 64% above the long-term median. So still a very high SPAT set again this year. SPAT means that next year there'll be babies, which means that the year after that they'll be bigger, and then they'll become commercial sized. An update on our sanctuary plan. So we have completed the Big Five, as they were called, in the Bay Agreement. We worked with our Oyster Advisory Committee, and we have identified 3 additional sanctuaries to do large-scale restoration in. That's Herring Bay, Hooper Strait, and the Nanticoke River Sanctuary. We've also engaged in some small-scale restoration in several of our other sanctuaries this year, including the Magathie, the Severn, the South, Eastern Bay, Nanticoke, and other parts of Herring Bay sanctuaries. So we're continuing to work through our sanctuaries. And I think it's important to note, we've recently done an analysis that looks at the health and success of these different sanctuaries. Some of them are doing very well, some of them are doing okay, and some of them are doing poorly. And that requires us to reevaluate and rethink how we're managing those sanctuaries, which we're underway right now, and we'll continue to engage our advisory committees on. Another space of oysters is aquaculture. And I think one thing, I went a little too far there, sorry about that. tipping you off to blue crabs next. Get excited. So we're up to 94,000 bushels of oyster aquaculture. Frankly, this is not anywhere near what we want this to be. We should be getting hundreds of thousands of bushels. If you compare the 94,000 to roughly 750,000 bushels of oysters from the public fishery last year, we see significant room for growth from an economic perspective. Also wanted to just flag for the committee, oyster aquaculture is an approved practice in our sanctuaries, so the sanctuaries could really also serve as an area to boost our aquaculture industry. Blue crabs. Blue crabs we manage in partnership with Virginia. So every year we sit down and we discuss management activities and our harvest limits. What you're seeing here is a fluctuation of the crab population over time, with the average being just about 400 plus million bushels. We're coordinating through and currently working through our Chesapeake Bay stock assessment, and we're going to have that updated in 2026, 27, which will again help inform our management decisions moving forward. And a really exciting component to these new stock assessments is our ability to overlay predation, so we can get a better handle on the impacts things like blue catfish are having on these critically important species. So now I'm going to turn my attention to freshwater fish. So this is a different part of the fishery for us. These are your creeks, your streams. This is where our trout anglers tend to spend a lot of their time. Again, we have a very large team that's working in these spaces, working on habitat restoration, as well as some really great recreational opportunities. This is one of the bigger economic impacts that we have in some of our western Maryland and central parts of Maryland, with over $400 million in economic impact from our trout fishermen for small businesses, our anglers, our guides. One thing I wanted to highlight specifically is the stock trout program. We see $27 million worth of economic activity across the state from that program, and a thank you to this body for moving the non-tidal fishing fees. That's very important for us to continue to fund that program. Next, we'll turn to invasive fisheries program. I think this is an area where we've seen the most growth as a department over the past couple years in recognition of the impacts blue catfish and Chesapeake chana were having, as well as flathead. So just to show, the blue catfish commercial harvest has been steadily increasing. We have an invasive catfish advisory committee that's going to allow us to continue to manage this species. And just this past Friday, and I'm sorry for going quickly, I originally planned this for an hour and I should have dropped a couple slides. Their catfish pilot went live. We're going to do this with 9 watermen. The applications are open until the 20th, and this will allow us to evaluate things like trot lining south of the bay and some novel gear type, which will help us continue to grow this program and grow commercial opportunities and offerings for our invasive species. One of the big things that our team in the non-tidal space focuses on is our brook trout. This is our only native species of salmonid. Obviously related to the salmon, but we've seen a rather significant decline. This is a really important species indicator for freshwater health and is a key indicator for us in terms of our Chesapeake Bay Agreement success. One of the things about climate change is that it is creating emerging fishing opportunities that we did not have before, and we're working to take advantage of those with our commercial and some of our recreational anglers. And what you'll see here is the creation of a couple different potential pilots for folks that are able to engage in and test new gear types. As we see cobia, red drum, grouper, bluefin tuna, and obviously the emergence of the shrimp fishery. So in order for us to get a handle around this, we've been working on develop a climate adaptive fisheries process and a menu of opportunities, which we scoped through many of our advisory committees starting back in 2022. The goal here being able to better utilize new data and climate related data, and for us as a department to be able to react more quickly to take advantage of species that are now commercially available. Shrimp being really a big one. It ended up we had to kind of come back, add that through statute. It delayed our ability to kick off a pilot, and then which will delay our ability to create a commercial license. We're looking to be able to do more of that through regulation, and that is touched on in the Governor's Bay Legacy Act. It will really allow us to diversify some of these fishing activities a little bit more quickly. And I wanted to end with a picture of many of our staff holding some of their favorite fish, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any questions? Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You did a thorough, quick job. You were talking really fast on that one, but you said some things that piqued my interest. And I'm not going to get into the weeds, so to speak, too much. But one statement you made, which I totally agree with, I really want to emphasize is you said things are changing rapidly in the Bay. And I agree 100% with you. And when I look at some of these surveys and I get calls frequently from fishermen throughout the Bay. I mean, I got a call yesterday and the guy said, well, I'm done until December. He said, you can't believe the amount of big fish in the upper Bay right now. He said, I set 5 boxes of net yesterday. I had 71 of these monsters, 50, 60, 70-inch fish. Said, tore my net all up, threw them all back live. That was good news. But, something's happening when we got this many fish. And I've heard it this whole fishing season, up and down from the entire Chesapeake main stem of the Bay this year. The huge amount of fish, and especially these big fish, spawning fish. Yet you look at the numbers, and it's really disturbing to see that 5-year average. I was a victim of the 1980s 5-year average. I'll leave it at that. But when prior to the moratorium and the surveys weren't good then either. So when you make that statement of things are changing rapidly, I know that we've done the same surveys the same way for 71 years in the same places. I know that we've got this enormous influence of blue catfish, especially in the spawning areas. Wouldn't you agree that that some of these factors now are changing the patterns of spawning fish, or the juveniles where they're trying to find some sort of cover and where they're not being just destroyed? And I brought this up earlier. This fall, I guess it was August, they were doing the same survey in Ordinary Point, and the guy was catfishing right there. And he was close enough to where they were dragging the seine that he knew who the people were. That's how close he was. And he had 9,000 pounds of blue catfish right there. The day they did the seine survey, I mean, it has to have some impact on these numbers. So I see that, you talk about top of the Bay, the bottom of the Bay, from the flats to Tangier. I mean, wouldn't you agree that we need more data?
And absolutely, and I think when you touched on a couple key things there, Delegate, right? Predation on these juveniles, it's totally changed because of blue catfish. We're getting a better handle on that. I think the availability of food, because of when they spawn and when the plankton spawn, we are starting to see a misalignment there. There's a lot of questions we need to answer, and I would definitely agree we need more data. We also need to make sure that as we're building out new surveys, that we're going through that process of peer reviewed so that we can have them taken up by bodies like the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission, so that the surveys that we're doing allow us to make management changes. But we don't want to need, what we can't have happen is we start testing things without doing it the proper way, and then we can't bring that into the management discussion. So I absolutely agree with you, and that's why we're having that stack workshop, is figure out how we can better align and improve the science, just so that we can make better management decisions. Because I think, to your point, there are a lot more different impacts on the species than we had 5, 10, 20, 40 years ago.
I hate to bring this up, but we do have the Conowingo effect also,
Another long-term management challenge.
Long-term management plan. And my last question, Mr. Chairman, I could go on for a while, but I'll leave it with this. You talked about the sanctuaries, and not the big 5, but the other 45, I guess it is, or so, that has a multitude of results. 3 or 4 have done pretty well, 3 or 4 are average, but there's a huge number of them that have really declined. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I think when you look at it, we're measuring them based off of the index of abundance. We do have some that are very high, some that are medium, and some that are low. And I think what we are recognizing is that, one, not all those sanctuaries started in the same place, right? And so we need to get a handle on, did they improve because of natural conditions? Did they decline because of an environmental factor? We're still working through that understanding a little bit, but I think what we need to make sure that we're doing is driving that increase of abundance everywhere we can, because we know that, oysters are sedentary creatures. They reproduce from one singular spot. So the more of them we have in those areas, the more robust that population will be long-term.
Right. I mean, they all started in the same day when they went to they took 25% of the bottom and best bottom and created these sanctuaries for a 5-year plan, which has now been 15, I think. But wouldn't you also agree that maybe we should be going forth with some methods of trying to maybe rotational harvest or maybe doing some restoration on these areas that can make them produce again? I mean, we knew they were good spots in 2010.
Well, and I think there's a lot of work.
They were the best spots, I'll put it that way.
Well, some of them were the best spots. Some of them were not so great. Some of them, had no colts, right? I think that's also part of it, was what it looked like when we started. Also, we're taking into account. I think the key, and I would absolutely agree, where we can add more oysters into that space, either it's restoration, maybe aquaculture, right? There's opportunities in those sanctuaries to grow abundance and still have that economic opportunity. And I think we really need to drive in that direction.
So well, no matter how you do it, I mean, there's a shell component. So if you want to blend aquaculture into some of these sanctuaries, you still need to produce a shell, which is very little shell produced by aquaculture. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, and I think that's...
So you really need the public shell.
Well, and I think that's why we're looking at so many opportunities for substrate, right? I think the West Coast shell importation has been a really successful program. I think that's an opportunity for us to take what is frankly a waste product from another aquaculture industry and bring that into Maryland. We know it's safe, and it is highly effective, just like our Eastern oyster shell at growing oysters. So I'd absolutely agree. I think the shell component is one of our biggest limiting factors right now, and driving substrate into those spaces. That hard bottom, as you know, right, we need that so the spat can catch so that they can continue to grow.
Yeah. How many bushel have we brought in from the West Coast now?
Do you know that off the top? Yeah, I'll follow up. I'm not sure top of the head exactly what that is, but we can follow up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, any further questions for the Secretary? Okay, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. Colleagues, we'll take about a 3-minute pause so the system can reset, and then we will start our bill hearings.